Le coup de projecteur de l'éclaireur, Pascal Clairotte avec vous. J'ai le très grand honneur et le plaisir de recevoir le professeur Jeffrey Sachs. Est-il encore besoin de présenter le professeur Jeffrey Sachs ? Économiste, aujourd'hui directeur du Centre pour le développement durable de l'Université de Columbia à New York, il a en parallèle de sa très brillante carrière universitaire une grande activité de praticien en conseillant des gouvernements comme ceux entre autres de Gorbatchev, Yeltsin et de Kouchma qui fut le premier président de l'Ukraine indépendante. Il a également été le conseiller spécial de 3 secrétaires généraux des Nations Unies successifs, Kofi Annan, Ban Ki-moon et Antonio Guterres. C'est une voix aujourd'hui très dissonante dans le concert de narratifs officiels que l'on nous sert, de par son réel attachement au vrai multilatéralisme, qui est sans doute la seule chance ou possibilité, le seul moyen que nous ayons de nous sortir des catastrophes ukrainiennes et israélo-palestiniennes. Il convient donc de l'écouter avec attention. Professor Sachs, may I start with a simple yet blunt question? Why is war so ingrained in U.S. foreign policy?
Well, war has been at the center of American foreign policy basically since the start of the country. Remember that after a revolutionary war, which was the so-called War of Independence of the United States, the U.S. was then 13 states on the eastern seaboard of North America. And during the next 120 years, roughly, the United States fought its way across the North American continent and had wars that were under the flag of manifest destiny, that it was the destiny of the United States of America to control all of North America. When North America, all but Canada and parts of Mexico remaining, had by then become part of the United States, by the end of the 19th century, the United States began wars of imperial expansion abroad, starting with the Spanish-American War in 1898. And throughout the 20th century, the United States fought, of course, in 2 world wars. So did much of the rest of the world. But also the United States was engaged in countless other military actions around the world, especially after 1945, when the U.S. was the dominant power in the world. And it fought in many very bloody open wars, notably in Southeast Asia, the so-called Vietnam War, which was actually a war in Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos. It fought in dozens of other countries in covert operations led by the CIA or by other military units secretly, or sometimes not so secretly. And after the end of the Soviet Union in December 1991, the U.S. foreign policy rather explicitly, though not so clearly understood by the public, was to engage in a series of wars to topple regimes that had been allied with the Soviet Union, and hence wars in Afghanistan, in Iraq, Libya, and Syria, and now the war in Ukraine. These may not seem to be all together of one piece, but they are really part of a foreign policy that is very much organized around military power and regime change as the defining characteristic of the foreign policy. The notion is that basically U.S. Predominant power enables the U.S. to dictate terms and when push comes to shove, to use that power through military means, sometimes covertly. And it's estimated that there were 64 covert regime change operations led by the United States between 1947 and 1989 during the Cold War period, or sometimes overtly in open wars, typically also to change regimes to put in place governments that the United States favors. So this has a very long tradition, a mindset, a kind of arrogance, and it's extremely dangerous in my view. I have been writing for many years that the United States needs a new foreign policy because this one is a danger to itself and to the world.
So basically, the seek no devil abroad, John Quincy Adams and the talk soft with a big stick of Teddy Roosevelt were never realized.
Well, a big stick was part of Roosevelt's vision also.
Yeah, but talk soft first.
He was, well, just talk softly, but the stick was always there. And he was a real imperialist, of course. When he wanted the Panama Canal, he took it. And he, of course, made his fame in the Spanish-American War, which was a war under phony pretexts in order to begin America's overseas military empire. He was a real imperialist, impressive in some other ways, but I'm not a great fan of his foreign policy.
When we take a look at what's going on right now in Ukraine, which is a complete mess, and Israel, which also seems to be a complete mess, provided that we avoid Armageddon, what kind of new or changes in the current governance and security architectures do you envision?
We're in the midst of two absolutely dangerous and bloody wars because the U.S. and its allied countries or dependent countries refuse to negotiate with those they don't want to negotiate with. The war in Ukraine essentially is a war between the United States and Russia, especially over NATO enlargement, about U.S. military emplacements in Eastern Europe, and who will govern Ukraine, because the U.S. participated in a violent regime change operation in February 2014. And all along, the United States position was, we don't have to speak to the Russians about this. So the Ukraine war is a war that reflects the rejection of diplomacy by the United States. In my opinion, this is not a majority opinion, I would say, in the U.S. Or Europe, but it's my understanding of this war because I know of the many opportunities that the U.S. had to negotiate, and it rejected all of them. One of them, most notably, was at the end of 2021, when President Putin, in exasperation for the failures of diplomacy in the preceding decade, put on the table a draft U.S.-Russia security agreement that was premised on the non-enlargement of NATO to Ukraine. And the U.S. official answer was, we don't have to discuss that issue with you. So
how do you explain that Europeans did not put a stop to that then?
I think it's pathetic and sad, because I know that many European leaders opposed the NATO expansion when it was proposed in 2008. They knew it was dangerous and they knew it was provocative. But unfortunately, Brussels institutionally really fell under U.S. dominance in the past decade to U.S. lobbyists and to U.S. political pressure. The fact that NATO and the European Union are headquartered in the same city is very much mistaken for Europe, in my opinion, because really the EU, in a foreign policy sense, is an arm of NATO, essentially, right now. And I'm very disappointed that leaders of France and Germany and Italy and Spain and other major countries didn't say clearly to the United States, what you're doing is dangerous and provocative. It endangers European interests. We don't want you to do that, but they never did. And I really wanted them to do that repeatedly. And I spoke to leaders on many occasions, but they always ended up backing down, even when privately agreeing, because the United States, it was deemed, provided Europe's security in some sense, they thought or think, and therefore felt in a situation in which they could not effectively oppose or push back against U.S. policies. I think it's wrong and a mistake for Europe, a quite serious mistake.
Maybe also because of corruption, but that's another story. If we come back to global governance infrastructure, especially in the current context, where we've seen at the UN Security Council 14 countries voting for a ceasefire in Israel, and the UN being the only country vetoing this.
What's very notable about the current situation, both with respect to Ukraine and with respect to the Israel-Palestine conflict, is that most of the world is not on side with the so-called West. Now, what is the West? The West is the United States leading, with Canada, UK, European Union, Japan, Korea, and that's about it. So I'm sorry, in Australia, New Zealand, and I know a handful of other countries, not to insult anybody, but that's the West. And the West is, depending on who you count in and who is not in, is something like 10 to 15% of the world population. Most of the rest of the world wants a very different approach, not an alliance approach, but an approach based on the UN Charter, an approach based on a focus on sustainable development and economic and environmental challenges, not on endless wars, and certainly not on an international system with the rules written by the United States. The greatest Orwellian expression of our time is the rule-based order, which is the phrase the U.S. uses, and then Europeans use. Shame on them. Shame on them. If there's a set of rules, the rules are the UN Charter and the international treaties, and the UN Security Council and the UN General Assembly, and the International Court of Justice and so forth. Those are the rules. And that's what most of the world wants, is a rule-based system. I think it's crucial that we get there, actually. And as U.S. and Western relative power diminish, and this is certainly happening, because the economic weight of not only China, but China and India and the other BRICS countries, and more generally throughout the world, the spread of technology, literacy, voice, means that a U.S.-led order is a complete anachronism. And it was never that great an idea, but it makes absolutely no sense now. And so it was perhaps the case at the end of World War II for maybe the first 20 years or so, because the U.S. was the only economy that was enormously strengthened by World War II. Industrial and technological might were essentially unrivaled, though there was already the nuclear confrontation with the Soviet Union. But there was a period when the U.S. really was very dominant, and the U.S. In that period made many mistakes, but also did a lot of good in helping to establish the United Nations and helping to establish the GATT and helping to establish the European Community, indeed, and many other international organizations, the World Bank, the IMF, and so forth. These were real contributions to global public goods, in my opinion. But already by the 60s, with the U.S. enmeshed in Vietnam, and then during the later decades, a process of broad, maybe not broad, but economic convergence, let's say, deep narrowing of the gaps between the U.S. and the rest of the world was underway because technology flows across the global space. And by 2000, the idea of a U.S.-led system was clearly an anachronism, except in the U.S. imagination. And even until today, though, the American strategists and politicians are very nervous, they still propound the American-led system. Joe Biden, who's a man of the past very much, in his speech about the Israel-Palestine conflict, said that the world yearns for U.S. leadership. Well, this is an absurdity and a tragedy to believe that. He quoted Madeleine Albright's known expression that the U.S. is the indispensable state. This is 30 years ago, and it was not indispensable in her sense then, and it is certainly not indispensable in Biden's sense now. The United States needs to learn to listen and to engage in diplomacy. And this is would be a big change of the American approach.
Mm-hmm. How do you see the future of NATO and the EU in this context? I mean, NATO is on the verge of implosion because of the Ukraine. We do see pretty important tensions right now, and the EU seems to be pretty dead. I mean, Germany may be the first country who's going to jump out of that train.
Well, I think these institutions are likely to last longer, but they can't fulfill the purposes that they claim to fulfill the way they're organized right now. I personally want a strong European Union, but not one that is subservient to the United States or in which the EU is confused with and conflated with NATO. The OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, is really a very good idea. It's, first of all, an organization that is universal in Europe. That's much better than a bloc policy. It is an organization based on the ideas of collective security. Had Ukraine followed the prescriptions of the OSCE, it would have remained neutral rather than seeking NATO membership. And its pursuit of NATO membership has been a dreadful disaster for Ukraine. It's never going to happen, and yet it's going to do profound damage, already has, to that country. So OSCE is the right way to go. Collective security is the right way to go. And that institution exists, though it's forgotten for the moment, but I think it should be brought to active life.
I recall in the Balkans, people from former Yugoslavia was calling the OSCE the organization to spread confusion in Europe, which was mean. But understandable at that time.
It's understandable, but I'm a bit of an idealist in the sense that I think ideas matter, and that these concepts of what we should have matter, and they don't live up to what we need. But that doesn't mean that they should be discarded or derided. It means that we should make them function.
Okay. Um, uh, Regardless of the winner, what impact do you think the upcoming U.S. presidential election, excuse me, I'm a bit sick, the U.S. presidential election will have on U.S. foreign policy? Can we expect any inflection at all, or do we expect that train to still roll on the same rail?
Well, the U.S. is extremely unstable right now. It's not an accident that there's no Speaker of the House, though that is just one manifestation of this. It's not an accident that the government is always on the verge of closure, it seems, because there's no long-term consensus at all on the budget, which is a core function of government. We have the two likely candidates of the two main parties, one an octogenarian, clearly not up to the job of the president, physically, mentally, and I think even preceding his octogenarian years, I would say the same. And then we have another great destabilizer who is under many criminal indictments right now and civil indictments. And this is the state of American reality. So I think what the world can expect is instability from the United States, not a decisive change of direction or necessarily even of self-understanding. But the United States is about 4.1% of the world population. That means that there's more than 95% of the world that is not the United States. The United States is one out of 193 member states of the United Nations. That means there are 192 other countries that should get on with their business, even if the U.S. is internally divided and unstable. But it certainly means that the U.S., in my opinion, is in no position to lead anything. I would very much like it to be peaceful and cooperative with others, and that would be a magnificent contribution to the world.
How do you think we will be capable of getting out of the Ukrainian and Israeli quagmires?
Through diplomacy is the way out of these two wars. And right now, the view is that only facts on the battlefield will decide the outcome. Facts on the battlefield are likely to be both tragic and probably leading to greater instability and escalation, or at least the risk of that. And we need urgent diplomacy through the UN Security Council. And, you know, the United States can only veto so long if the rest of the world would unite. And that's possible. And if the Security Council remains deadlocked, the UN has a process called Uniting for Peace, which can put these issues into the General Assembly. And this is what is absolutely needed right now. I still believe that the voice of the world matters a lot. And it should be expressed more clearly, not left on the table at the Security Council with the U.S. veto, but expressed clearly to the world, and if necessary, through the UN General Assembly.
Would it be fair to say that Israel's fate rests in the hand of Arab states today, much more than it did in the past?
Well, I think Israel's fate rests in its own hands principally, because if Israeli leaders, the Israeli public recognize that there is a path out of this current crisis that leaves Israel more secure and living alongside Palestinians peacefully, Israel would have the future that most Israelis want. If Israel believes that it's going to continue to dictate facts on the ground through military force, it's in for a tragic awakening to new realities in the world.
Professor Sachs, thank you so much for your time.